so much for staying so long. And because I'm so short, I'm going to stand. I was going to stand here until I saw that will hit me, so I will stand here. For those of you who can't see me, I'm the squeaky voice behind the platform. So I was going to do three things and answer three W questions, if you want, on healthcare. Why, what, and where? Why should we look at healthcare? What is it that needs to be done? And where is it that entrepreneurs can focus on? So let me start with why. So here is the simple fact about healthcare. When we created the National Health Service in UK, in 1945, we used to spend just about 1% of our GDP on healthcare. In the 50s and 60s, we spent 2%. In the 70s, we spent 3 to 4%. In the 80s, 5 to 6%. In the 90s, 6.5 to 7%. Today, we spend 9% of the GDP on healthcare. If you believe our Treasury, they believe by 2020, we should spend about 12% of the GDP on healthcare. The French almost already do it. The Americans will spend 16 to 18% of the GDP on the healthcare. And if you believe our very well-paid colleagues in McKinsey, they will tell you that we have to spend about that. If you project the current growth, you spend 40% of the GDP on healthcare by 2050. What that tells you is that we're looking at an industry that is fundamentally has become unsustainable. And while that's the good news, I guess the bad news, well, while that's the bad news, I guess, the good news is we've been here a whole bunch of time before. Back in the 40s and 50s, we got rid of rationing by re-engineering food distribution. In the 60s, we did it with retail. In the 70s, manufacturing. In the 80s, financial services. In the 90s, telecommunication. In the last decade, technology. And I think it's time now for us to look at public services in general, at healthcare in particular, and education. Now, every time an industry has become unsustainable, so let me move on to the second question, and is what is to be done? Every time an industry had become unsustainable, people went back and looked at its very basic economic value equation. And if you define economic value as quality over price, you would kind of say, let me understand what happened in healthcare. The denominator of equation, and just look at UK, but every other country is almost the same. The denominator of the equation went from 37 billion pounds of expenditure in 1997 to 111 billion pounds of expenditure today. So the cost of the National Health Service in UK went up threefold. At the same time, the nominator of the equation, quality, clinical outcome plus patient experience, did not go up by anything of the same sort. It certainly went up, but nothing of the same amount. And what that very simple single equation tells you is a very upsetting truth. And that is in the last decade and a half, throughout the globe, we witnessed one of the largest destruction of values happening in human history. Just look at the PCs you have in front of you and see what happened with the dirt industry, right? The Moore's law, quality went up, doubled every 18 months, price fell down continuously in real terms. And compare that with what happened in healthcare. So when we sat back and we said, so what do you do here? And we talked, I mean, obviously being involved in healthcare, you have to be involved quite a lot with politicians. And they always ask, so what is the solution in healthcare? And for us, the answer comes to look at every other industry and where did the disruptive innovations in every other industry come from? And the answer is simply it came from the newcomers. You know this in the technology sector. Those entrepreneurs in the technology sector know that extremely well. For decades, IBM controlled 90% of global profitability in technology. And then in 1975, some clever person invented the PC. And as a result, the cost of playing in technology went from millions of dollars to thousands of dollars. And then what happened? Microsoft did what IBM could never do. Yahoo did what Microsoft would never do. The clever guys in Yahoo, who at the time were at the forefront of the internet, wouldn't even buy Google for $1 million. They thought it would never work. Google never did what YouTube did. YouTube didn't do what Facebook did. Facebook didn't do what Twitter did, and so on and so forth. Innovations always comes from new entrants. And there is a very good structural reason for that. And the structural reason for that is if you're involved in an industry and you're involved in a value chain, you're too pregnant with it, you're thinking too much of what you're doing to start thinking of the new value proposition. So there sits, if ever before in history, if you want, innovation came by lowering the barrier to entry, see what we're doing in Britain today. We're taking a £110 billion a year gamble, which is growing at the rate of 6 to 7% a year. And to put this in numbers, the amount of money we spent, we just increased the budget of the NHS last year in Britain is almost equivalent to all the money we spend in England on primary schooling. Just the increase on the budget of the National Health Service. For all of us who have to put our children into private schools because public schools are not good enough, just think how much money we are spending on one versus the other. So the gamble we're taking in Britain today is a gamble that says it is perfectly okay to believe that the incumbents in healthcare, the government monopoly that dominates it, is going to innovate itself and create disruptive innovations that will change the system of delivery. And I think what our politicians need to do, and the big task in public services and in healthcare, is simply bring the barrier to entry down, allow others to play, and allow others to come in and provide the services in different ways. And they can. I mean, I give you an example just to put this in perspective. In the National Health Service in UK today, we do about 650,000 cataracts a year. Those cataracts cost us in the region of £1,000. If you do a cataract operations in the United States of America, it costs you in the region of $1,500 to $2,000. There's a company in India called Ariadne Eye Care, provides cataract to poor Indian population in the same population catchment of 80 million people. It does about 450 to 500,000 cataracts. They have better clinical results than Johns Hopkins University. They certainly have better 5-year visibilities, less infection than the National Health Service in UK. How much do you think they do that cataract for? £1,000, we do it. Raise your hand if you think they do it at 200. Lower or above 200? Who thinks they do it lower than 200? How much lower than 200? 100. How much? Who said 30? You are the most intelligent man in this room. 97% reduction in cost. Think about that. Can they come to this country? Absolutely not. Because our royal colleges, our manufacturers, our hospital groups, they would make sure they get no saying into Britain. So healthcare is not that difficult to solve. The future is already here, it's just badly distributed. And what we need to do as entrepreneurs in healthcare is to figure out areas and places where we can focus on to fundamentally change the value equation in healthcare. For those who come in and say that I want to deliver healthcare exactly as it is today, but I'm going to buy a hospital group, I'm going to leverage it to the hill, I'm going to make sure I can increase its prices by 5% a year, reduce its cost by 5% a year, only put 20% money into it, and then in 10 years' time I've tripled my money or blah, blah, blah. That's not going to solve anything. All that does is just create another pile of debt base for this. What we need to do is think about how do you fundamentally change the value equation. How do you change the top, quality, clinical outcome, patient experience? How do you reduce the cost of the delivery? And here is 4 areas that I think entrepreneurs can focus on. And by no means these 4 areas are exclusive, and people can think of a variety of others. So when we got into healthcare, we asked, where do we focus on? And we ask ourselves a series of simple questions. Why is healthcare such a zero-sum game? How many of you have recently been in a hospital, or how many of you have got friends who are doctors, nurses? Vast majority, right? Talk to them. Doctors hate nurses, nurses hate the managers, managers hate the payers, payers hate the providers. It's a complete zero-sum game. It's an industry in which people's incentives are completely unaligned. And if you want to re-engineer any industry, the very first thing you want to do is align everybody's interests. We just heard from Rob, who, as you could see, have significantly longer hair than me, is taller than me, is better good looking than me, because he chose a much more fun industry than I to get into. The grass always seems greener on the other side. But he talked about aligning people's interests from providers of content to distributors of instruments in order to bring a service into the industry. So the very first thing we did, we said that, look, you need to create a partnership in which everybody benefits from the creation of the new service. And at the beginning, people told us you can't do that. You can't put 50 doctors together in a room, let alone ask them to be in the same partnership. Today's Circle, I believe, is the largest partnership of clinicians anywhere in the world outside the United States. We have about 1,600 consultant doctors in our partnership, 2,500 clinicians. We just won a contract from the government to run the very first NHS hospital that will be run by the private sector. And if we can achieve that, we would be about 5,000 clinicians in our partnership. And everybody's an owner. And I'll come back to you. It says mixing the needs of the big transformation with the big society. I forgot about what I agreed with you, so I didn't really talk about that. But I'll come back and try and weave it in somehow. But we created a partnership, and I'll come back and say why. But we aligned people's interests. And I think there is a lot of money to be made, but more importantly, a lot of progress is going to be made for those people who can figure out how to align people's incentives and create a social network within healthcare. Secondly, the question is, why are hospitals so dreadful in their infrastructure? For those of you who haven't been in a hospital recently, your average hospital makes you feel sick when you're healthy when you go to visit a friend. Right? So we thought, can you not make a hospital fantastic? Why is it that when I go on holiday, I go and stay in a great hotel, if I can afford it, or we come to a conference or a place like this, but when we are at our worst, when we feel our most vulnerable, we end up in a dump, like vast majority of our hospitals. So we said, can we fundamentally change that? And again, that's not out of vanity. Go back to the simple value equation to say, could we change clinical outcome and patient experience while prices are staying the same? So here is what we did. We got Norman Foster to design the very first hospital he could. He just won the award for the best public space globally. Go and see it on our website. BBC did a film on it. I thought it's just a fantastic thing of a 5-star hotel that he created. Then we got Mandarin, the people who brought Mandarin Oriental into UK to come and design the service. We asked that who is the most luxury hotels in the country. The answer was Lucknow Park. We went and stayed there a few nights, got to know their hospitality people really well. Then we installed them and brought them over. And then we got a Michelin star chef to come and cook for our patients every single day. Not design the thing, but come and cook. Now, all of that to NHS patients at NHS prices. And by the way, if you're a private patient, we just charge you a little bit more, and we give you exactly the same service. But you feel better about it. We got a program of now building about 20 more of these hospitals across the country, but the point is, if you come in there, you need to fundamentally change the infrastructure. And even if we build our 20, 30 other hospitals, it's a drop in the ocean. There is so much room for others to redefine the experience of secondary care. And actually, even better, don't do it in the hospital, do it somewhere else. Come up with better ideas to do it somewhere else. But infrastructure of healthcare needs fundamental change. The third question is, what is healthcare? Is it a professional services industry, or is it a commodity business? Because I tell you what, it is not run like any other professional services sector that I know. It's a complete top-down business. The Prime Minister tells Lansley almost, and Vito Lansley tells everybody, but actually it's the Prime Minister who does the Secretary of State nowadays what to do. The Secretary of State because the General Secretary or the Chief Executive of the NHS what to do, who tells all his cronies what to do, who gets the Chief Executive of a hospital what to do, who tells the manager of the orthopedic ward what to do. By the time it gets to the doctors and nurses, they actually know very little about the business of healthcare. They cure the patients, and increasingly we are trying to tell them that how to do that, how to run their pathways, but they have very little autonomy over what to do. And if you think about vast majority of professional services, we talked about McKinsey before. I used to be a banker at Goldman Sachs before. I shouldn't say that in a JP Morgan sponsored event, should I? And I always admired JP Morgan when I was in Goldman Sachs. But you know how professional services are run. We run in tiny little groups. We each kind of manage our own services. We manage our own clients. And the closer you are to your client, the more powerful you are. A very good friend of mine, and Gary, is the CEO of Goldman in Europe. It's just the worst job to have. He's probably the least powerful partner they can have, right? Because actually, the power resides with those who are closest to the customers, who generate the fees, who solve the customer's problems. And think about how does that happen in healthcare. The closer you are to patient, the least powerful you are. The closer you are to the top of that value chain, they're more powerful. So one of the things that needs to happen in healthcare is a complete change of a business model and the structure of the operation. So one of the things we did was we said, why don't we change it around and allow those who are the closest to the patients create the small little clinical units, run a hospital the same way we ran Goldman. And people said that's impossible. It's like giving the key of the asylum to the lunatics. So we did. We bought a hospital group. We gave the key of the asylum to the interns. And guess what happened? One single year. And now, to put this in context, you know this massive crisis that we are saying that our NHS has now? And it says that it needs to save £20 billion in 3 years. That's a 3 to 4% productivity gains a year, right? And they're saying it's impossible, it cannot be done. So in one single year, the lunatics improved productivity by 20%, in the second year by 13%, in the next year by 5% so far. Patient satisfaction went up from 47 to 60% to 99%. Five-star hotels don't get that. And we ask every single patient 3 simple questions. What's the one single thing that we should not touch? What's one single thing we should fix? Do you recommend it to a friend and a family? 99.3% say they do. Return to theater is 20 times in some of our facilities lower than the national target, 6 times in others lower than the national target. And staff satisfaction, 90% of our staff are either happy or very happy with their job, 75% very happy with their job. Why? Because it's a partnership, they own the business, so therefore they kind of have the things that give all of us happiness in our jobs, which is autonomy, complexity, and a relativity of their efforts and their output. But what I'm trying to say is not so much to say we're doing a good job. Believe me, it sounds a lot better from when I say it than the reality of what we're doing. We have all our problems like any other business. The problem is, what I'm trying to say is there is significant room for improvement by just changing the business model of healthcare. And we need many, many different people to come in there to do that. So how much do I have after half an hour I said I would?
You have another 15 minutes?
Another 15 minutes. So I got to fill it with another 15 minutes. So I'll go back to the big society, if I can, which is important. So that's what we do. That's where I think people get, and the final where you should be focusing on as entrepreneurs is in the technology in healthcare. Look, yesterday, I don't know how many of you watched News at 10 in UK, but there was a piece at News at 10 by the London, in the London kind of local news, that the Secretary of State had gone somewhere and there was a guy standing with his iPad and he was asking patients some questions. And that was big news. The fact that there was an iPad in a hospital and the patients were answering things, that was big news, right? There is no technology in healthcare. Vast majority of doctors still use pen and paper. And then it gets translated back there. For those technologists among you, the opportunity to fundamentally change the way healthcare is delivered through use of technology is huge. My children spend a gigantic amount of time on their Skype talking to their friends. And the other day, I noticed one of them, my son, describing in graphic details that I will not share with you, an issue he had with a part of his body to another friend of his same age. And I thought that other person on the other side could have been a doctor, right? There is so much you could do by just changing the paradigm of how consultation and how delivery of care can be made with the use of technology. If we communicate and we deliver services in healthcare in the way that we are now doing it in our shopping, in our retail, in our banking, in many other areas of services, where you used to have very expensive, big infrastructure. Do you remember if you wanted to have a bank, you need to have a place with big marble on the floor? And who goes to a bank anymore? The banks are getting rid of their checks, and as we will hear shortly, people are using fantastic different technology to deal with money. So those are the areas that people can focus on. And let me finish by what is my passion, and it's not necessarily about healthcare, but it goes back to why I think the government needs to butt out of healthcare a little bit and allow the passions of this country, the talents of this country to try and solve some of the problems they've got. And we're among friends, so I'm going to say this because I think it's important. The passion, we're lucky in Britain because we have a prime minister in a way. I'm not political, I'm not kind of vote for any particular party, so I don't say that because I'm a Tory. I say that because I just think that he's got it right on the issue of the big society. And what is important about that, and I was very lucky that he was celebrating his, first year in office, and he invited a small group of people with their wives and husbands to celebrate with him, and I was lucky to be in there. And the reason he was, and the speech he made, or the talk he was giving to 20 of us or so, was all around his passion for the big society. And many of us will turn back and say, well, why this big society agenda? What does it matter to you? And I'm going to kind of relate that to healthcare. And the reason it matters is because look what we've done in Britain. The question I've got for you is this financial crisis we are facing across the globe, but particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, and particularly in Britain, is that incidental or is it structural? We all know why it happened. It happens fundamentally because some bankers overtraded credits they did not have, but certainly the government, on the other hand, overspent the budget it did not have. That's the truth of the matter. And today, as a result, the British government spends £1 out of every 4 that it spends, it borrows, right? The question was, is that incidental or is that structural? And I know that you spent a great deal of time this morning talking about the structure of how this happens. And I think that was fundamentally structural. And the reason was structural was this. Imagine if all of us in this room sit together and start a new business. And for those of you who live in Monaco, like my friend Andrew, that's different. But for the rest of us, and the business becomes really successful, what do we do with it? We basically take almost 50% of that economic value, and we hand it to the government, and we take another big chunk of the remainder, and we give it to the financial institutions in insurance, in investments, in pension, and what have you. And these two, economically speaking, intermediaries, through time, take our money and buy all the assets in which we work. 90+% of all assets in Britain, productive assets in Britain, are owned either by the state or by financial institutions. That leaves, and that's unique in the Western world. If you go to a restaurant in Britain, it's most probably owned by a company that is owned by a chain that is owned by a big business that is owned by a big finance. And if you go to a restaurant in France, it's most probably owned by a family who's been there for 50 years, the waiter is 60, and they have a connection to their community. Where is our middle stand in Britain? Where 40% of German business, 30% of German businesses are Mittelstand, 40% of North Italian businesses are medium-sized employee-owned businesses, right? We don't just have that in Britain. And for those of you who say, well, what's wrong with that? What is wrong with that is look what happened with Cadbury. Cadbury is a great example of what was good for the shareholders was not good for the long-term interest of our society. And actually, the shareholders, those who call them really greedy and horrible and look what they've done, actually it was their fiduciary duty to sell it to the highest bidder at the time that they had to, and they did. They didn't do anything wrong. They just did what the norm of our society says that they should do. As a result, we got 2,000 families in Bristol area who are unemployed. That's about 10,000 people, 6,000 children who are going through life thinking that they probably would have done, how's life going to work out for them, right? And what did that money happen? It went to a group of people, then it went to kind of the same channel of people paid it in taxes. It's time for us to rebalance our society. And in rebalancing our society, we need to start by looking at our public services. The biggest part of our economy now, 53% of our economy, is in the hand of the state. Back in the 80s, late 70s, the problem was the private sector. Margaret Thatcher fixed that by fundamentally reforming the private sector in UK. We generated 20 years of wealth that came out of that. We all did very well out of it. The time now is that bit by bit, little by little, we took that money and we put it into our public sectors. 53% of our GDP is now spent by the public sector. And it's suffocating our country. And it is now time to let it go. And if we let it go and we release it to people and re-engineer the delivery of that, a very gigantic piece of that is 111 billion pounds of it today, 120 billion pounds of it shortly, is the National Health Service. And in freeing that up, that you will create gigantic amount of economic value for this nation. So I invite you to think, as you make your investments, but also as you think about where is the next place for you as great entrepreneurs to think about the National Health Service. It's a good area to make money, but more importantly, it's a big service to the country. Thank you so much.
Thank you.